Okay, here's the video blog for Monday. So I just sent you or I posted in Canvas the Hawaii PowerPoints. If I was getting really fancy, I would bother to re-edit them for this class, but to be honest, just sweep forward to panel 6 in the 1-1 Hawaiian from the 340 class, and that'll just get you to where we want to go. We're going to go through this really quickly because this is largely covered in the 340 class, which we spent a whole chunk of the semester on. So like the case with Aotearoa, your Polynesians are coming up from Eastern Polynesia, in this case, largely probably the Marquesas. We're not particularly sure why, but the archaeological evidence and the linguistic evidence suggests the Marquesas, possibly the eastern part of the society group, but most likely the Marquesas. So folks are coming up from the Marquesas. So originally you have obviously the location of Hawaii, the fact that they figure out that it's there. Then what they do is they move up and start deciding for whatever reason they settle in Hawaii. It's important to remember this occurs long before the settlement in Aotearoa. Estimates range from basically 1,000 years ago to maybe 2,000 years ago for the arrival here, which predates the Aotearoa case by, well, Aotearoa is generally assumed to be maybe 12 or 1300, so way earlier. And one would assume that the story of what Hawaii was about was obviously a part for the reason for migrating to Aotearoa. Important to remember that unlike Aotearoa, there's a long tradition of movement back and forth of small groups of people. So sailing from Hawaii to Tahiti, Marquesas, from the Marquesas, Tahiti to Hawaii was something that people did occasionally. And important to remember that was incredibly difficult. Probably most importantly, incredibly expensive in the sense the amount of resources that you had to consume to build the ship, to basically put a crew on it, to get them up here, etc. So it was not something that people did lightly. It wasn't like hopping. It was sort of like sailing from maybe the West Coast to Australia in a 20-foot boat. You can do it, but you better make sure you know what you're doing. Otherwise, you're just going to disappear. So it was something that people did, understanding it was very risky. Like Aotearoa, they arrive here and wham. More so than Aotearoa, because Aotearoa, the minute they landed, they must have realized they'd really put themselves in almost a nightmare. Nothing would have made any sense there. The vegetation's entirely different. The animals are entirely different. Everything about it, lack of reefs, everything about Aotearoa must have been an enormous, total shock. Arriving in Hawaii, especially if you arrived on the windward side of the islands, like Kaneohe, which is one of the spots that's tagged as a potential first landing, would have been maybe trickier because we're subtropical here. If you flash back to, maybe a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, you get those cold winds coming off, especially in the Kona season, the temperature drops, and it gets, by our standards, pretty cold here. You're not going to get that in Samoa or Tahiti or something like that. And this is because we're subtropical. Now, the plants and animals that have been here for a while have adapted to that. But this is why a lot of the stuff you see in Polynesia doesn't really do very well here. Breadfruit's probably the classic example. It grows incredibly poorly here. Even in places like Kaneohe, you'll see breadfruit trees around, but in most cases you can't eat them. The fruit, whatever, I guess it's a fruit, is basically inedible because of the amount of fibers. And the reason is that it's too cold for the plant to be happy. It'll survive here, but it won't be happy here, so it won't generate food. The giant or large swamp dalo won't grow here at all. You can grow it in an arboretum, but it has to be in a greenhouse. You can't grow it just out on the land here. Dalo, yam, all the traditional Polynesian crops take roughly 2 to 3 times as long to grow. And when they do grow, they generally generate about maybe 1/4 to 1/5 of the same amount of food per plant. So in some ways, Hawaii was probably a nastier surprise because I would suspect on initial arrival, especially if they came here they probably would have come here in the Kona season. So they would have come here maybe in December, January, February. It might have been a little colder. but it would have pretty quickly warmed up, and they would have looked around. They would have seen reefs, not very much reef, but they would have seen stuff. It would have looked sort of like home, except it was a hell of a lot larger. But then when they actually started to try to use the place, they would have realized it was actually no better than Aotearoa. The vast majority of plants here are either inedible or don't sustain life. About the only one that does is the thimbleberry. You have some of the same ferns that you can turn into starches, but there's not really any evidence that the Polynesians here did that particular move. The animal vegetation here pretty much gets hit the same way that they do when they eventually go to Aotearoa. They go after the large numbers of different species of flightless birds and pretty much just hammer a lot of them right into extinction. But that's just because out of desperation, they really didn't have a lot of choice. They needed food, they needed protein. That was all that was available on the landscape because what they had brought with them wasn't doing well. And the reefs that initially seemed to be attractive were really pretty marginal. Reefs here, because again of the subtropical climate, the fact that the waters are slightly colder, a lot of the major species, especially of shellfish that you find in Polynesia, you don't see here. And again, like the land environment, the shellfish here tend to be a lot smaller, and they tend to reproduce a lot slower. So it's a lot easier to basically burn your way out of what looks like a food system, and all of a sudden you realize there's not a lot there. So the settlement shock that the Polynesians got here really had a huge impact on them. And it took about, as far as we can tell, somewhere between 200 to 500 years for them to actually figure out how to survive effectively here. And a lot of that was just a matter of genetically manipulating plants, for example, by virtue of selective breeding, so that they would grow better here. Having said that, if you go out to Waiholei Waikani, for example, and go pick some dalo there, that dalo takes roughly a year to grow. And if it's a purple variety, it takes about a year and a half, so 12 to 16 months. Those same, the original forms of those same varieties grow in Tonga and Tahiti in about 6 to 9 months, and the corms will be 2 or 3 times as large. In fact, if you ever, well, once the pandemic panics sort of eased up, if you go down to Chinatown or someplace and you look at the Chinese dalo for sale, which is the really big ones, that's actually the size of a Polynesian dalo. If you look at the Hawaiian dalo that's for sale, it's these poor things about the size of an apple. And that's gives you some idea what the Polynesians would have been in terms of shock. You can feed a hell of a lot more people on, Chinese size or Polynesian size dalo than you can its Western, its Hawaiian counterpart. Yams even more so. The yams are really, really tiny. So one of the side effects of this is a very quick realization that because it's subtropical, there's a huge impact of what we call microenvironments here. This isn't true in the rest of central Polynesia, because in central Polynesia, your tropical environment pretty much gives you have variations in terms of amount of rainfall, but you don't really have climatic variation. Here, the environment's just radically different. I now live in the back of Waialae Malka. And on the ridge that I'm on, we get basically 1/3 the amount of rain that you get 3 blocks away down at Wilson School. And that's literally the spot that you could just stand here, and if you had a good arm, you could throw a rock down there to hit it. It'll literally rain there. You walk up towards our street, and boom, the rain stops. That's very typical of Hawaii. If you're on campus, the next time you're on campus, the rainfall you get on campus is totally different than if you go 4 or 5 blocks into Palolo Valley, or even further up the ridge. These very small microenvironments that in many cases are just a couple of blocks are really typical of Hawaii. And again, what happens is when Polynesians adapt to become Hawaiians, if you want to call it that, what they're doing is they're realizing how to exploit these microenvironments. But to do so, it takes so much knowledge that you become very, very place-bound. Farmers in Palolo probably had very little interest in being involved in farming in Waialae or farming in Manoa, because the conditions were so different. So what you became is sort of like modern academics. You become a micro specialist. And this is probably one of the biggest changes in the shift from being Polynesian to being Hawaiian, is this real focus on very small, relatively speaking, areas. Now, by Polynesian standards, the areas are still pretty large, but given the huge amount of space you're talking about, they're actually quite small. There's very little evidence, for example, that the Hawaiians moved into this part of Kona, this part of the island of Oahu, till about maybe 500-600 years after they figured out how to survive in the windward region. There wasn't that many people, and it was just too much of a hassle to figure out how to use a particular place. and then she really committed to it. So you get this microenvironment or micro place interaction, if you would, where people embrace a particular location. That location then feeds them and becomes their home in every way, shape, or form. Now, in that, not surprisingly, what then happens is people identify the place by virtue of developing a classic Polynesian system. So you end up with ancestral stories, the explanations of why something's there. That becomes tied to the idea of extended family, of the clan. And so there's this very strong integration of place and family, as you find in the rest of Polynesia, but maybe even more so, or not that it's more so, but there's probably more of a gap from one family to the next because each family would be specialized in a particular physical location. Probably wouldn't have a hell of a lot of interest in folks in another part. Now, ironically, if you think about it, you still see a little bit of this today. We still have a very strong sense of identity of place at a very, very small level. Kapahulu, for example, versus Kaimuki. Kaimuki versus Palolo. In part, that's probably also from our Japanese heritage, but much of that is actually from also the Hawaiian heritage, which is somewhat unique to this place. It's not based like it would be in Central Polynesian on your family and the village. It's based on the physical environment, which is different than the other environments. So the structure looks the same. Excuse me. Extended family, more place-based, or more defined by place, maybe. Now, in the 1500s probably, we end up with that Arioi, or Oro cult, as far as we can tell, comes up here. Jean Charlot back in the 1980s, 1990s was probably the only guy I know who looked into this in some detail. But what happens here very clearly, because it's actually in oral traditions, is that there's a radical change that occurs here in the Hawaiian Islands, brought up from a guy or a group that are termed pa'ao. Now, we don't know what pa'ao means. We don't know if that's the name of a title. We don't know if that's the name of an individual. There's no pa'ao family, so there's no clan heritage that ties to this. But it's very clear in the oral traditions and the chants that something called pa'ao comes up by ship from the south, sets up shop in Puna, in the Big Island, at Va'ulaheo, which is now under lava, and starts a new religion. The descriptions of the religion are exactly the same as the Arioi religion in Tahiti Marquesas, so there's no doubt it's the same thing. It shifts eventually, but the logics are exactly the same. But if you look at the rest of this panel, here you see the changes. You go from the classic Polynesian Matai, the head of a family, the classic clan, Ainga, the classic representative of a region, which is the various Aingas being in a formal or regional association. And that's what we had here. What this turns into by the 1600s with the expansion of the Pa'ao sort of social religious system is a caste system. The new caste system has 3 social groups. The Ari'i, which is obviously just a phonetic version of Ariki, the dialect, if you would. What's interesting is the term Manahune, which is still in existence in most of Polynesia, gets lost. It gets replaced by a new term which is Maka'ainana, people of the land. But this is sort of an interesting term because when they become of the land in this new system, it also means they don't have legitimate control of land. In other words, they're part of the land, but they're part of the land by virtue of the whim, if you would, of the Ari'i. At the bottom of this, and this as far as we know is unique, though if you look at Melville's Taipei, remember I mentioned that I think last week, this American sailor who ends up in the Marquesas, he talks about slaves, but his command of Marquesan was not good, or else he didn't bother putting it in the book. And here in Hawaii, unlike the rest of Polynesia, you find the term kauva, which means people without mana. Now, we're not sure exactly how you came to be kauva. These aren't outsiders, they're Hawaiians. But by the 1600s, you find settlements, villages, if you would, of folks that are defined as kauva. Now, these are pretty much limited to the Big Island. You find some of these there's some rumors of them on Maui, but we don't really have good oral traditions. But there's very explicit traditions on the Big Island of kauva settlements, both in Kona side and also in Puna. So we suspect there are probably in other areas. I just didn't bother mentioning them. And these were very much, the closest version would be, if you're familiar with Japanese society, would be the idea of Brakumi. Separate, isolated societies controlled by military bureaucrats set there by the Reiki of that particular region. So what you find is basically a three-tiered system. Most importantly in this, which goes back to, again, this Arioi, is the fact that the Arii are supposed to have really basically no contact with the Makai no. The function of the Makai no is to serve the needs of the Arii. The two do not interact. Arii don't go out surfing and talking story and going fishing with Makai no. These become caste groups. If you're born into that group, you stay in that group. So you can end up with Arii who are basically incredibly poor, just living in a little spot, but they're still chiefs. And you end up with Makai no who might be fairly successful, but they're never going to become chiefs. So this becomes a fixed caste system. This isn't a class system. You can't move up and down anymore. Most importantly, what it also means is you don't have a system based on the competence of someone. So if you go to back to the idea of the big man in Melanesia, and the idea of the Matai, for example, in traditional Polynesia, this is an entirely different thing. You get this by virtue of genealogy. Now, not surprisingly, one of the side effects is, if you're familiar with Hawaiian chant and Hawaiian traditional oral traditions, you find that there's two types of oral traditions here. There's an oral tradition that talks about basically Amakua and Akua. It talks about the spirits that are of families, and families are of spirits. So again, Pele, Kamapua'a, Hi'iaka, the classic sort of, old stories. Those are very traditionally Polynesian. Now, if you think about it and you're familiar with the stuff, you also reason the whole second set of these, which is the genealogy chants. Now, most of the ones we have left now are the chants from the Kamehamehas, but there's a few of the others still around. But these were public relations events that were generated by individuals to say how powerful they were. And then this chant, what you do is you tie yourself to as many powerful ancestors or many powerful, predecessors as possible. Kamehameha rather famously had, the argument goes between 3 and 5 different genealogy chants. There's 3 that are still common use, and there's rumors there were another 2. And every time he became more successful, he changed his genealogy to reflect his increased success. Makai no in the Eastern Islands in Hawaii were not allowed to do genealogy chants. Genealogy chants were the purview of the Arii. Makai no found doing genealogy chants would be executed. So what you end up with a ritualized caste-based system, which you can see down here in the thing. Which you also end up in Hawaii, and this is unique in the Pacific, is you end up at some point probably tied into this, but again, this is a very complex, change that's occurring. Remember, this change is occurring entirely here. This isn't foreigners or outsiders bringing this in. Yeah, the religion's brought in, but what it turns into or evolves in is something that Hawaiians developed. And what they developed is, on one hand, an impressive thing. On the other hand, it's pretty grim. The impressive part is you end up with enough of a serious population, especially of people who are in charge, that you can actually afford to have specialists. Now, you have to remember, when you're talking about a specialist not only means that you have specialized knowledge, it also means that part of the population is going to feed you and house you. So you have time to spend being specialized, which means that you don't have time to spend doing the normal stuff like planting crops, et cetera, et cetera. So specialists are a reflection of the fact that you now have Makai no. So basically, you can then tax to give you the resources to have specialists. And these would be the Taunga or Kahuna here, who are your large group of your specialists. By the late 1600s, early 1700s, you also have military specialists. You have whole regiments, for example, for some of the Big Island chiefs, or believe us more accurately, battalions of folks, of guys that are raised from a very young age to do nothing but be warriors. And that again means that one of the things they're not doing is not being farmers or fishermen. So the farmers or fishermen are feeding them. And so this is unique in the Hawaiian Islands, this idea of very sophisticated, very almost state-level specialization, which, just to jump ahead, is one reason why when the Europeans arrive here, especially the British, or your first, contact group, they're incredibly impressed with Hawaiian society. On one hand, they recognize that it's Polynesian. On the other hand, they're much more comfortable with Hawaiian society from a British naval perspective because Hawaiian society looks a lot like the British Navy. It looks a lot like a European country. So it sort of gives the Kamehamehas who are in charge at the time, or I should say get in charge pretty quickly, a chance to sort of present themselves as a European equivalent, which wasn't available if you're a Matai, for example, in Samoa, or if you're even the Pomares in Tahiti. You have your group, but you don't have this level of bureaucratic specialization. In fact, you don't have bureaucrats. Here you did. So to the Europeans, this meant Hawaiians were, quote, more civilized, unquote. Sadly enough, what this also means is you get a change in warfare. And in this regard, it looks a lot like what happens in Aotearoa, but probably for different reasons. Here what happens is chiefs, the Ari'i, start to grow not only in power, but also in their acquisitiveness. So what you start to see is chiefs beating up on other chiefs, not only for prestige, which would be classically Polynesian, but now they're also taking stuff. So what you end up is, for example, Kalaniʻōpuʻu is probably the most famous Kamehameha's dead, is actually going after, he and the high chief of Oahu, Maui, Kahekili, spend about 30 years doing nothing but fighting each other. And Kalaniʻōpuʻu is the one that triggers this most of the time. And what he's actually doing is he's landing, for example, usually in Hana or somewhere in the eastern part of Maui, and he's trying to take it over. So he's not landing to pick a fight for bragging rights. He's landing because he wants to control the property. He's going to take it over and acquire it. He wants to be an ari'i ai moku, which is not a term you would have found in traditional Polynesian. This is a very Hawaiian concept. So you end up with chiefs constantly acquiring more of the land of other chiefs. They not only kill those chiefs and then sacrifice those chiefs, or in some cases marry those chiefs, but they acquire their property. So you no longer have the idea that you're pretty much limited to your relationship with the ancestors in a particular property. Now, if you've got the military power, you can take it. And this ends up in the really brutal warfare you see in the 1700s, where Kalaniʻōpuʻu, for example, gets his butt handed to him on Maui. So he sails around and basically wipes out all the population on Lanai, destroys the plants, kills the animals, kills or enslaves the people, then goes to Molokai, does pretty much the same thing with most of the island there, and then goes back to the big island. All he's done is he's basically destroyed the lifestyle of two islands. There's no bragging rights here. He's just pissed off because he lost the battle. But the fact that you would go to another piece of real estate that doesn't belong to you and just destroy it just because it's like Thursday and I feel like it is really unique to Hawaii. Even in Aotearoa, you don't see the Maori doing this. So the folks that become, quote, high chiefs here end up with a very, very, very different mindset that you see in the rest of the Pacific. And this, depending on how you want to look at it, works to their advantage or disadvantage when they bump into the Europeans, because it means that when someone like Kalaniʻōpuʻu is dealing with Captain Cook, he sees him as, on one hand, competition, but he also sees him as potential partner. It's not the way that the Europeans were seen by the rest of Polynesians. It's a very complicated change from one spot to the other. But the high chiefs here had so much power and were so aggro that their relationship with Europeans was probably more simple than it was in the rest of Polynesia. They pretty much did figure out what they wanted to consider the Europeans, and the Europeans were just another tool to your eventual control of the islands. But if you're familiar with Hawaiian history, of course, this is coming up. Well, that's what he was incredibly successful at. He was incredibly successful taking everything that was given to him or presented to him, especially the Europeans, Vancouver, guns, and the whole thing, and turning it to his advantage to control the island chain. And that's unique. It's very different than the Pomare strategy, for example, in Tahiti. And the strategy that no one particularly, tried in Aotearoa or in Samoa or other places. So this next panel is sort of the summary of these changes, which I've just sort of gone over. Most of these, if you're familiar with this stuff, fine, you've already seen it. If you're not familiar with it, don't get hung up in it. It's just sort of a detailed explanation of these changes, which we sort of did at a more superficial level in the rest of the Polynesia groups. What is really sort of key, and this is where, well, we're going over this on Wednesday too, but also just a little bit to finish up here. When you're looking at Hawaiian society, you have to remember that Hawaiian society goes through enormous change in the 19th century. One thing that always irritates me that people always forget is we were an independent state till 1899. We were a kingdom till 1893. We were an independent country till 1899. And then that's when the actual formal takeover to become a territory was. So we remained independent way beyond any place else in the Pacific. And that's something that I don't think gets enough discussion here. Usually everyone talks about the overthrow of the monarchy, and there's a lot of really sloppy, bad history. Oh, the Europeans came in and took Hawaii. Dude, he was dead within a year of arriving here. And this place took him. The Europeans didn't control Hawaii unless they did it with the acceptance and willingness of the high chiefs, either ruling families in Hawaii, right into the late 19th century. So on one hand, you might say if you want to blame someone, there's more blame to go around with particular families. On the other hand, the idea that Hawaiians just rolled over and were passive to a group of Europeans coming and basically dictating stuff to them is entirely erroneous and a good example of a bad history. So when you're going through this, what's important to remember then is Hawaiians were going through this, century, 2 centuries of radical change, literally from year to year, day to day. What you got were changes that occurred both internally, but also were brought in by virtue of new ideas being brought in, or in some cases actually sponsored by chiefs, for example. But you have to remember, this is on top of 100 years prior to the Europeans have changed. So if you want to, change in Hawaii started the minute Pa'a landed the Big Island. But then especially by the 1600s, with the change in the relationship of chiefs in the land, the change in the relationship of Ari and Makainana, Hawaiians were going through a situation where you can pretty much guarantee that no one was growing up in the world that their parents had grown up in. It wasn't changing as radically or as quickly maybe as it does in the 19th century, but it was changing. So when you look at this, what's sort of interesting to realize is the change was selective. The groups that had most to benefit from change, and this would be the folks that define themselves as Ari'i, were the ones that were going to jump on change. And this is the same group that jumps on change in the 19th century when the Europeans show up, because they are the ones who are vestedly winning, if you want to think of it this way, with change. With the idea of a caste system, they benefit. For example, if you go to Papa'ina and Hao, which doesn't exist anymore, but that's now La Pietra, the huge, the Wakini or sacrificial Hao that dominated this part of the island down in Waikiki, that was only open to chiefs. Only Ariki could go onto that Hao. Only Ariki, who were Tonga, or if you would, the subset of the chiefs who were the priests, the Tonga, Kuna, they were the ones that did those ceremonies on that Hao. Ironically, if you're doing a major ceremony, like when Kamehameha comes to Oahu, you only sacrifice other Ari'i on the Hao. Makainana were not seen as having enough mana to be worth the trouble of a big ceremony. So what happens is this new change, this Ari'oi Pa'ao thing, defines the situation that only chiefs can talk to gods. So the Ari'i are the ones who interface with the Akua or state gods. Makainana or everyone else have to ask for a chief to talk to a god for them. They can't talk to the god themselves. So if you want to think of it this way, is what happens is Aumakua become demoted to the modern concept of Aumakua. People can still pray to their family ancestors, but they don't do it in public, and they don't do it in a formal setting. That's the prerogative of chiefs, and that's why we have Heiau here, our version of Marae, who are only for the use of chiefs. Commoners caught anywhere near a Heiau were executed on the spot. Well, in most cases, they were actually saved for a ritual ceremony. So in that, what happens is you end up with a split, if you would, between the progressive faction, which would be the chiefs, and the more conservative faction, which finds themselves being called Makainana. This persists down till today. This is one of the confusions you have here. And again, you don't see it in the rest of Polynesia to the same extent, simply because in the rest of Polynesia, you can get this divergence in terms of who had power and who didn't to the same extent. So if you look at what persists in this sort of shopping list I've got here, you notice that what happens is mana remains. You end up in this really sort of tug of war in terms of who can access mana, how you access mana, which never really gets resolved, because to a certain extent the Makainana sort of, if you would, go underground. So the old system, the pre-Pa'ao system, still survives in part in Hawaii right down till today. And this is the things that people talk about when they talk about their Makua, in the sense of, you know, they're related to a shark, or they're related to a owl, or they're related to, you know, the pig. And that's in your traditional Polynesian idea of Ainga. And families still do that. But there's the thing, if you look at your high chiefs, a Kamehameha never makes any statement about being related to Pele, for example, or Kamapuaa. You find them related to the four gods. And so your chiefs basically end up with a new pantheon of gods. And commoners in many cases, of course, obviously had to accept that. But for much of the Makaʻanao population, they still persisted in the older ways of doing things, which makes for a fair amount of confusion even today when people are talking about these, because you end up with different versions, the same term used in different ways. Yeah, landscapes thing, you know, you go into that, that's just, oh yeah, one thing I should mention, this is unique in Hawaii. Right, my special area is East Maui. Most of the population in Southeast Maui was actually shipped over there by Colonial Pulu, and later again by Kamehameha when he took over Maui, but also his dad did when he took over that part of Maui. So the actual Mauians, I guess that's the word, who is the folks that could actually claim descent to that part of Maui over generations, if you would, the Makaʻanao and lower ranked Ariki of that part of Maui, disappeared. We don't even know what their families were. We don't know what the families were named. We don't know anything about them. It might still exist somewhere. I suspect maybe in the newspapers there might be something like that. But the newspapers are such a furball to try to find stuff in. If you ever worked with the Hawaiian language newspapers, it's probably there, but you know, it's going to take a while to find it. So the families that exist in East Maui, who are Hawaiian families, are actually all brought over from Kohala and the Big Island. They're shipped over there by the high chiefs. The Ari'i Moku basically grab a group of folks in North Kohala, basically say, congratulations, I'm now moving you to Maui. Now, traditionally in the rest of Polynesia, you couldn't do that because those folks are tied to place by virtue of ancestors, et cetera, et cetera. In Hawaii in the 1700s, it was an entirely logical and pretty much normal thing to do. You don't trust the people you've conquered, so you either genocide them or move them off the land, and you replace them with people you can trust. And so this arbitrary movement of people, which is fairly common from east of Oahu through the Big Island, was something that's unique to the Hawaiian Islands. You don't see it anyplace else. And I should point out, sort of as a final note, is the Hawaiian Islands never embraced this new system to the same extent. When you pretty much move west of Kona and the island of Oahu, there's a lot less embracing of this new system, of the idea of the special role of chiefs, for example, the limited role of Makaʻanao. When you get to Kauai, for example, and Niihau, you find that they really don't buy into it very much. Chiefs there have much less power. It's much less ritualized. There's very few puhonu or nuakini. It's a much more traditional system. Even a lot of the chiefs on Kauai would claim descent through ancestors. Something that you wouldn't hear even, for example, with the high chiefs of Oahu. The Waianae apparently was sort of not quite full buy-in to all this. So the Hawaiian Islands weren't a package deal. The eastern part of the Hawaiians, especially the Big Island, really got totally on board to the Oro, Arioi, Pa'ao thing. So think of sort of the distinction between Tahiti, which is a buy-in, and say Samoa, which isn't. It isn't quite as graphic, but the westernmost islands here in Hawaii really weren't all that bought into this whole thing. And it makes for some interesting distinctions even down till today in terms of when people consider themselves traditionalists, just exactly what tradition they're talking about. And the Big Island and pretty much of Maui, if you're a traditionalist, you're actually talking about the Pa'ao type traditions. For example, the reverence of Heiau, the reverence of this, the reverence of that, tied to the special role of chiefs. If you get to the Western Islands, what you find is place becomes a much bigger deal. And of course, this becomes a huge, complex issue when you think of all the issues of place that we're dealing with in 2020. So with that, that's enough to give you guys confusion for a day or two.